And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Ben Lieberman, Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation. In Ottawa, Tim Wise, Director of Renewable Energy and Efficiency Policy at the Pembina Institute. And here in studio, David Crane, columnist for the Toronto Star and several other newspapers, and Ben Dawkes, Policy Analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute. And as I welcome all of you, both here and in Points Beyond, let's start by just making sure we're all sort of on the same page here. If I say going green, I suspect it's going to mean a different thing depending on where you're coming from on this. So Ben, why don't you start us off? Ben Lieberman, that is, in Washington. If I say, what does going green mean to you, you say what?
Well, I think with the stimulus package and the so-called green stimulus package, it has both meanings that we would be able to improve the economy while improving the environment. That's the hope of this green stimulus and the rhetoric surrounding green-collar jobs and so forth. So it's green in both senses. That's the theory, at least.
Tim Wise, what do you say?
I would say going green is really tackling climate change head on and investing in the technologies that we're going to need to invest in and the new economy that we're going to need to create to make low carbon economy, that is, to make sure that we're going to be able to address the issue of climate change. David Crane?
Well, I agree with Tim. I think it's going from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. That's essential if we're going to deal with climate change. And in the process of doing that, we create the opportunity to invent a lot of new technologies and to create a lot of jobs in the process.
Ben Dawkes.
I think it's really just reducing your impact on the environment, no matter what that is. Whether it be climate change, whether it be toxic sludge, whatever it is.
Ben Lieberman, is it possible to stimulate the economy while at the same time being environmentally friendly?
It depends on how you engage in environmental protection, but I think for the most part, it's an either-or proposition. Most of my environmentalist friends admit that the things they want to do have a cost. They argue the cost is worth it. But this new argument that there is no cost, that there's actually benefits, that it's a win-win situation, that we can essentially simultaneously spend ourselves rich and green, that strikes me as overly optimistic.
Tim Wise, are you overly optimistic? One of those people Ben Lieberman's talking about?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there is a real cost, and I don't think we should be shy about acknowledging that. But at the same time, we also need to recognize there's an even bigger cost of not acting on all the pollution that we've been emitting into the atmosphere, and that's the cost that we haven't been talking about today.
Well, David Crane, one of the things I've seen, and I think Ben Lieberman wrote about this in one of his pieces, was that the notion of the term green stimulus is impossible. If you want to be green, that means lack of growth. If you want to stimulate, that means grow the economy. You can't do them both together. Is he right?
No, he's absolutely wrong. I don't know why he'd say something like that.
Well, I'll ask him after you're finished your answer.
Okay, because if you're going green, you're investing in new technology, you're investing in new transmission systems, you're doing a lot of things that are smarter, smart electric grids, which are much more efficient for the delivery of electricity. You're investing in new power systems. If you do something that's really smart, and here I'll stick my neck out, have a carbon tax. Really set a high price for carbon.
Because that went over so well in the last Canadian election.
Yeah, but it was mishandled. It's still the best way to go. Create a carbon tax. You create a market for all these new innovations and new investments, and that contributes to economic growth.
Well, let me get Ben Lieberman just to weigh in on the initial thing. Is the green stimulus, the idea of that, a contradiction in terms?
Well, I think if you look at the real-world evidence, I believe that it is. The ideas in the green stimulus package are not new. They have been tried, and if you look at the places where they've been most aggressively pursued, there's some real problems there. For example, in the U.S., the state of California has long been held out as the model for this kind of thing, for this green stimulus, for green-collar jobs and so forth. They've pushed very aggressive measures to pursue energy efficiency, renewable and alternative energy requirements. They've been rolling out some tough greenhouse gas emission standards, a number of other green measures, and that has been touted as a model for the rest of the U.S. to follow. The only problem with that is that over the last few months it's become abundantly clear that the California economy is an absolute basket case. I think because of these measures, at least in part because of these measures, we're talking about unemployment that's significantly higher than the rest of the country. So ironically, it's the state that's done the most to try to push green-collar jobs that actually has higher unemployment. You have the state near bankruptcy, if not already there. You have businesses thinking about fleeing, and some have already fled. And at a time where President Obama has announced a task force to deal with the issues facing the middle class, to be headed up by Vice President Obama, you have in California a state where the middle class is leaving in droves. So I think there's some real problems when you look at where these kinds of aggressive policies have been pursued. I'd also
okay, hold on. Before you do also, let me get some reaction.
Of correlation. It's like studying a whole group of people and discovering that a lot of them watch movies and then discovering that they tend to get cancer and then saying, well, because they watch movies, that must cause the cancer. This idea that because California is facing economic difficulties is a direct result of pursuing green policies, I think it's fallacious. And we certainly shouldn't guide us in Canada.
Tim Wise, what do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the California example terribly well, but what I think is important is to look at some countries that have, do have real big success in developing whole new industries. I mean, Germany, Denmark, Spain have all invested heavily in new technologies, and it's one of their biggest exports now is exporting wind turbines and exporting solar panels. So you can create a whole new economy by investing in these technologies.
Okay, I think it's widely acknowledged that they're sort of ahead of us in all of those things you just mentioned. Are we too far behind in terms of making those environmental investments right now to be players in the world?
No, not at all. We definitely are behind, but at the same time, it's important to recognize that particularly wind energy, this really only burst onto the scene in the last 10 years, or maybe 15, but Spain, for example, is a good country to look at. In 1998, they had almost no wind turbines, and now they're the third leading wind energy producer in the world, as well as the third largest manufacturer in the world. So when a country puts its mind to it, within the span of a decade, can really retool itself really, really quickly.
Yeah. Ben Dawkins, I don't know if you guys have studied this at the C.D. Howe Institute, but obviously a number of governments in Canada and the United States are looking at what's the right percentage of our gross domestic product that we ought to be investing in as governments. On the so-called green stimulus side of things. You got a number that you could share with us?
Well, I can't throw out a number, but I can tell you some general principles about
Sure.
what green stimulus can do in the short and long term. In the short term, I think there are some major issues with green infrastructure because if you're looking for short-term stimulus, you're looking for things that are timely, that are temporary, and that are targeted. And it's hard to say that green infrastructure really does this. There are some major concerns about whether or not there are enough solar panels to install over the next 6 months because there's a lot of talk about shortages. It's the same thing with wind power. People who are losing their jobs in housing construction, these are plumbers, these are drywallers. These are not the kind of people who are going to all of a sudden start building windmills or build subways. So whether or not it's targeted at the right sectors is really up in the air.
David Crane, you've heard this. These projects, the criticism goes, are not shovel ready.
No,
That's the allegation.
Yeah, and it's true in many cases, but that doesn't take away from the need to pursue them.
But it does suggest that they're not going to stimulate the economy in the short run.
No, but I'd make another point, and that is I don't think we're in for a short-run economic problem. This year will be very tough. Coming out of the recession is going to be unusually slow. We're still going to need stimulus in 2010 and 2011.
But people are worried about 09 right now.
Yes, they are, and justifiably so. But I'm saying in terms of looking at the stimulative effect, we're going to be needing action, not just for the next 6 months, but for the next 2.5 years.
But if you're a decision maker in government and the idea is to get stimulus today, not a year or two down the road, but today, does a green stimulus package do that for you?
Well, virtually nothing does it for you today. What can you do?
Shovel-ready projects do it for you.
Beg pardon?
Shovel-ready projects do it for you.
Well, how many?
There's a bridge over there. It needs rebuilding. Go over and do it. You can do that.
It doesn't start tomorrow. None of these things start tomorrow. I mean, this is a fallacy, I think, that this stimulus is very important for two reasons. One is because the recovery, going through the decline into recovery, is going to take 2.5 years. And so we're going to need it over that period of time. It'll take 5 or 6 months to get projects up and running, or perhaps even longer. But the other point is we should use the stimulus period to do the things that have to be done anyway, and it make us better off when we're back in recovery. And green stimulus does that.
Go ahead,
But
Ben.
the things that were going to be done anyway are by their very nature not stimulus. If you're just subsidizing a renovation that someone was going to do anyway, what new aggregate the amount you're creating. It's just a windfall gain for these developers or homeowners.
Tim Wise, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some projects that are shovel-ready and there's some projects that aren't, but probably the one area that addresses a couple of the concerns we've been talking about is investing in home energy efficiency. I mean, this is a sector that's been hit very hard. We have people that are out of work in house building, and but those people can go back to work immediately in renovating homes and upgrading energy efficiency. And this is a type of project, not only is it shovel-ready, but also does have a stimulating effect, in the very near term, because you're not only putting those people back to work, but you're reducing people's energy costs in their homes, and that's money they have in their pocket to then start spending again.
Okay, let me share a graphic with you and our audience now. This is a graphic from the Pew Research Organization. It's a poll which talks about what people care the most about right now. And the top priorities, these are American numbers, top priorities for 2009, the economy, number one, obviously, 85%. Jobs, 82% of people put that as number one. Terrorism, 76%, still pretty strong. Social Security, and I gather whether it will be there when people need it, 63%. And then look way down at the end of that chart, there's people who are concerned about global warming, only at 30%. And if we looked at that list a year or two ago, global warming obviously would have been much more significant. So, Ben Lieberman, let me start you off with this question. We'll go around the horn on this. Is this the right time, given those numbers, to be thinking about green stimulus projects?
Well, yeah, I think there's an interesting point to be seen in that polling, and that is that a strong economy is important for environmental protection. As you all know, the modern environmental movement was created in the wealthiest nations, not the poorest nations, not even the dirtiest nations, the wealthiest nations. They're the ones that care the most about the environment. And at times when the economy goes down, you see the environment dropping as a priority. That's why my concern that the stimulus may actually do more harm, I think that's what we really need to be concerned about. We need to get the economy back on track. Only then will we really be genuinely concerned about the environment and ready to do the kind of things that would make sense.
Ben Dawkins, what do you infer from those numbers?
Well, from those numbers, you see that the long-term need is something we've got to look at. We've got to look at not just what's going to happen this year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, but 15, 20, 30, 40, 50. And the best way to have climate change on the agenda for 50 years is to have a long-term permanent carbon price. And that's going to create a long-term sustainable investment climate for green energy programs.
David Crane.
Well, I agree with Ben that we have to have a long-term carbon price. And what bothers me right now is that we are coming to address climate change, but we're going to do it in the wrong way. We're going to have a cap-and-trade system. This makes lots of money for lawyers, lots of money for banks, and as Jim Hansen has said in the U.S., we'll create a lot more millionaires on Wall Street, lots of work for lobbyists to get exclusions. It's a very inefficient system, and that's the way the Americans are headed now. We want to piggyback on it for bad reasons. But we need a carbon tax. A great point about a carbon tax, and it's now been endorsed in a way by the chairman of Exxon, the chairman of General Motors, and the chairman of Ford. It creates a market. You set a high price for carbon, you progressively raise it, it creates a market for people to change their behavior, and secondly, it creates a market for innovators because they know there will be a demand for the things they want to innovate on when they bring these things to market.
Let me give Tim, though, I do want to give Tim a chance to respond to those numbers. Tim, those numbers have got to, just make environmentalists furious, given that the environment had been an issue of singular importance to so many people for such a long time, and then as soon as the economy goes south, so apparently does concern about the environment. Don't you hate that?
Well, I mean, I think the numbers in Canada are actually quite a bit different than the numbers in the States. We just commissioned a poll about a month ago, and 65 or 64% of the respondents said that Canada should not be scaling back its commitment to the environment in the face of the economic crisis. So,
how'd you ask the question?
So I think, I think Canada and the States are probably different scenarios. But having said that, I think it's important that politicians, obviously they have to follow polls, but you shouldn't be making their decisions just on the whims of public opinion. But they have to be looking at what science is telling us. And what science is telling us is we're headed towards an even bigger economic crisis if we don't address climate change head on. And that's something that it's just not going away, even if the public isn't totally aware of it.
Well, of course, the President of the United States has weighed in on this in a significant way. Let's hear what he had to say about it, and then we'll come back and chat. Michael, Barack Obama, please.
Each day brings further evidence that the ways we use energy strengthen our adversaries and threaten our planet. We will restore science to its rightful place and wield technology's wonders to raise healthcare's quality and lower its cost. We will harness the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories, and we will transform our schools and colleges and universities to meet the demands of a new age. All this we can do. All this we will do.
Yes, we can, says the President. Ben Lieberman, to you first. People have always said education, health care, national security are crucial issues for them, and they test very high in public opinion surveys. Should saving the environment be up at the top of the list with those concerns?
No, I actually think that the public may be onto something with global warming. Forgive me for being the skeptic here, but I think that science is turning away from alarmism. I believe there's truth to global warming, but I think virtually everything the public's been told about global warming that sounds terrifying is not true, is not supported by the science. And what is true is less terrifying, and I think we're seeing, a credibility gap. For example, when Al Gore blamed Hurricane Katrina in 2005 on global warming, I think that was a tactical mistake because we haven't had anything even close to Katrina ever since. The fact that 2008 was a slightly cooler year than 2007, and we're sort of in a holding pattern regarding warming.
Can I just interrupt you for a second, Ben? Are you sure the former Vice President blamed Katrina on global warming? Because as far as I know, he's always been very careful to say, I can't tell you that hurricane over there happened because of global warming, however, comma, ...
I don't think he was quite that careful. After all, he had a number of images in his book and movie, Dead Bodies in the Streets in New Orleans. And this is a book about global warming. I think the implication's clear.
Okay. Ben Dawkins, you want to put environmental protection up as high as national security, health, education?
Well, I agree with the idea that there's maybe a bit much alarmism, but that doesn't ignore the fact that there is an insurance premium to taking out or taking off a big part of that risk off that table of there being a major climate catastrophe. So you have to take some sort of measure, even though it's something that won't appear for 50 or 100 years, and it's hard to blame it on or say that it's seen in a hurricane. But there is a very strong case for doing this.
Tim Wise, the Kyoto Protocol was not successful when economic times were good. Why would things be any different now?
Well, I think probably one of the big things is the science actually is telling us the opposite of what was just said, and the fact that it turns out that most of the science to date has actually underpredicted what the current thinking actually is on the seriousness of this issue. So we can't just wheel it away or pretend it's going to disappear. And I guess. Yeah, there is some uncertainty, but we have to remember that uncertainty cuts both ways. That we may be underpredicting things, but we may be overpredicting things, but we may also be underpredicting things, and we really need to be thinking about what we can be. This is ultimately a transition we're going to have to make, and I think everyone's slowly coming to that conclusion that we are going to have to get off fossil fuels. We are going to have to get to a low carbon economy. So. Let's start moving in that direction. Let's start being leaders in that direction, and build a new economy around that.
Even General Motors and Exxon now understand the issue in a way they didn't even 3 or 4 years ago. But climate change is also a national security issue. There was a big study released in the United States, I think last year, by a significant group of retired, very senior U.S. military officers at the general level and their equivalents in Air Force and Navy, warning that climate change was a major security threat to the United States. The British Cabinet Office has released a study last year explaining that climate change was one of the major security issues for the British government to address. Even our own CSIS put out a report about 3 years ago arguing that climate change was a security issue for disruption in the countries most heavily affected, migrant flows, competition for resources, all kinds of things coming out of this. So that to pretend it's either or is wrong.
False choice, you think?
Yep, it is a false choice. It is a security issue. Try to imagine a world with the kinds of disruptions on food supply and flooding and all these other things that we know can happen. Imagine what the security and peace and international tension issues would be in that scenario. It's very much a security issue.
Ben Lieberman, there is an old expression that says, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think I heard Rahm Emanuel, the President's Chief of Staff, say it the other day. So the question, I guess, for you is, does the current recession create an opportunity for environmentally friendly technology and the firms that create it?
No, and with regard to the national security issue, I think there's a risk from global warming, but I think there could be a greater risk from global warming policy. And I think with regard to national security, with regard to food security, we saw that actually happening with the use of biofuels and the impact they had on higher food costs. And if you remember, biofuels were justified in part as being a way to combat global warming, but the food versus fuel trade-off, using food for
Sorry, go ahead.
Using food for fuel did raise food prices, did cause some unrest and even rioting around the world. So you have an example of global warming policy actually creating instability and not global warming. I'm not aware of any real evidence of an impact on food supplies up till now due to global warming. For example, we've had a general warming trend over the last 30 or 40 years, and at the same time, we've had great increases in food productivity.
Okay, David.
Biofuels is not a climate change policy. Biofuel is an agricultural policy to raise the price of corn for farmers and for all the people who are tagging on to these great subsidies to build these processing plants to build to create these biofuels. I would never equate biofuels with a climate change policy or a green policy. They're the opposite.
But Ben Lieberman, I'm not sure you gave me a one-word answer, but then you went on and talked about something that I hadn't asked you about, and I need you to address the issue of whether or not the current crisis does provide an opportunity for new environmentally friendly technology and the firms that create it to boom.
No, I think it would be tougher to do at this time, as the polling shows. And again, I wouldn't agree that these technologies are winning technologies. I think that's something for the market to determine. As corn ethanol turned out to be something of a dud, I have a fear that wind energy may be the same. It's succeeded only due to very substantial government subsidies and mandates. As soon as the incentives go away, so does the wind turbines. I would think at this point, and wind energy is many decades old, that it would be able to survive on its own if it had any real merit as a competitive source of electricity.
Ben Dawkins?
Yeah, the subsidies to green energy, solar power, wind power, are quite substantial. So to say that this crisis, this very short-term crisis, is going to change those already existing subsidies, I think is wrong. If you want to look at the long-term potential of green energy, it depends not on subsidies that we have right now, or even subsidies in 5 years from now, because we know that these subsidies in 5 years from now, we don't know anything about these subsidies. They could be gone, they could be much higher, they could be much lower. So these companies don't know if they're going to be in existence 5 years from now.
Well, one thing we do know is that Jim Flaherty, the Minister of Finance here in Canada, did offer up $1 billion over 5 years for green infrastructure. So he's got that on the table right now. And Tim Wise, I guess I want you to weigh in and tell us, you've analyzed that. What do you think of what he's offering?
Well, it's nowhere near enough, is what it comes down to. I mean, $1 billion over 5 years in infrastructure projects gets eaten up pretty fast, especially when you look at the range of issues that they want to cover with that money, which includes wastewater issues and grid infrastructure and all sorts of in transit issues as well. So it's sort of a drop in the bucket compared to where we need to be going with in those types of investments.
Well, David Crane, there's no drop in the bucket in the U.S. President Obama proposed $100 billion to develop renewable energy. There wasn't any money for renewable energy in the Canadian budget. Should the two countries be working closer together to get their act on this going?
Well, they should, but I want to raise in relation to that another point. We've been talking a lot about green revolution and green technology tonight, but it's basically been about windmills and solar panels and a little bit about biofuels. There are two very important other things that are happening, which could be even more significant. And even our friend Ben Lieberman in Washington might agree on this. A lot of money is going to be poured into developing technology for coal and oil sands so they can be used in a much more environmentally friendly way. And by this I mean the investments in carbon capture and storage technology. That investment and that research is being speeded up as part of the stimulus package, and people can be put to work on that research and demonstration and pilot projects in fairly short order. Secondly, in our own budget, we have a big chunk of new money for nuclear power, to develop nuclear power technology.
You object to that?
I think it's a good thing. I think that in terms of, we still have problems with wind power in that we haven't found an efficient way to store energy. So that when you're dealing with the base load, the electricity that people expect to have available whenever they need it for essential things, you have to be concerned with the base load. And so that is nuclear power. The alternatives are coal and hydro. So that we have capacity to make great progress on the nuclear side, I think. And so that's another part of the discussion. Hydrogen and fuel cells, another part of the technology can be developed. So it's not just about wind power and solar power. It's about a whole range of things that we should be talking about.
I appreciate that, but now I'm going to incur your wrath by asking Tim about wind and solar, despite what you just had to say.
Well, I'm not against it.
Of course.
I'm just saying there's more.
Tim, I do need to find out from you, though. These technologies did not exactly take off in this country, wind and solar I'm talking now, when economic times were good. So what's the rationale for thinking that now that economic times are terrible, they may take off now?
Well, they have been growing at a rate of about 30% per year since 2001, particularly wind power, in which wind power actually employs about 12,000 people in Canada right now, just in the wind energy industry alone. So I wouldn't say it's a small industry by any stretch of the imagination, and it's been growing. It's been growing pretty steadily over the last little bit, and there's a huge pent-up demand for a number of projects that are under development right now. It's more a question of policy. There's all sorts of projects that are under development, and it's a question of can they actually get onto the grid, as opposed to there not being enough money, I guess, or enough money in the economy right now to get them going. It's a question of actually, can these projects get onto the grid?
We'll follow up with this, Tim. There's a group in Canada, I gather, called Power Up Canada. They're proposing a 5-year green energy action fund. They want to create green bonds. How would that work?
Green bonds is something that would work similar to Canada savings bonds, where you could have individuals putting money into savings accounts, I guess. Then the government would back the loans, and then that would make capital accessible to projects, to green energy projects that then could, who might be having trouble getting either funding because they have a newer technology, or because they're just, there's the general constraints on accessing capital. So if they had a special pool set aside for green bonds, as something that they'd be able to access. I do quickly, if you don't mind, I want to address the intermittency issue around wind energy, and I think there's one thing we need to clear up, and you have countries like Denmark and Spain that are already generating close to 25% of their power, 15 to 20% of their power from wind energy, and they don't have any issues with base loading. So I think we have a long way to go. We could ramp up wind energy 10, 20 times in Canada before we start to worry about some of those issues that were brought up earlier.
So this is just the Pembina Institute reminding us that they're not big fans of nuclear power? Is that what that line's about?
Well, nuclear power may have a time and a place, but one of the big issues around nuclear power is that the reality of it is it takes about 10 to 15 years to develop a nuclear project, and there's a huge public consultation and issues that go around developing nuclear power. Whereas we know renewables can be put in the ground, within 1 to 2 years sometimes.
Much faster.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the big issues, is that renewables are much more shovel-ready at the end of the day.
Ben Dawkins?
Well, a lot of the renewables that you're seeing proposed aren't shovel-ready. Take a look at, say, wind power off East Toronto. This is something that's well in the planning stage, but there are huge NIMBY effects. No one wants a windmill in their backyard. So there's got to be a full environmental assessment. There's got to be a lot of planning that goes into these projects. So I have a hard time believing that windmills are going to be shovel-ready.
Probably take less time to get up, though, than a nuclear power
Absolutely.
plant. Okay, agree with that. Ben Lieberman, let me come to you on this one. Your president says that he wants 1 million plug-in hybrids on the road by the year 2025. Is that doable?
I don't think it's doable, and my concern with it is setting targets like that. If it makes sense, I believe it would happen in the marketplace. Obviously, a vehicle that is more economical than what we currently have would do very, very well and would be very, very profitable. I really don't see a role for the government in picking winners and losers among the various alternative flex fuel plug-in hybrids being one of many. Setting targets from Washington, D.C. doesn't really seem to work. We're seeing that again with the corn ethanol standards where we have targets, but that doesn't mean that that amount of fuel makes any sense to use. I would rather see the federal government here in Washington stepping back and allowing the marketplace to figure out which among the many alternatives makes the most sense. Really, when we try to pick these winners and losers, as the federal government has been doing since the 1970s, we have an awfully terrible track record. We usually end up picking losers, and so we end up actually hurting the prospect.
David Crane made a comment, a little aside there, saying like the internet. Okay, I'll leave it out in the ether. David, here's my question for you. Where is the evidence you see that suggests that people will be prepared to pay more for green vehicles during an economic downturn?
Well, the vehicles aren't ready in any large number right now, but the way you, Ben from US talked a lot about let the market decide. The way you make a transition to a new technology is by creating a market. A high carbon price will force people to consider hybrid and other vehicles. That's the new market. When our gasoline prices went up through the roof a year ago, people started to shift. Then prices collapsed and they went back to old habits. If you had a policy which said we will never let gasoline prices go below a certain level, you would create a market for these technologies.
We have politicians
and then that
who are
market
gutsy
would
enough to do
decide.
that. We have politicians who are gutsy enough to say we're going to put a high floor on the price of gas.
Well, they've done it in Europe for years.
I'm saying here.
In here, well, I think Stéphane Dion tried to do it. His problem was that he mixed social policy in with a carbon tax policy, which confused people. And secondly, he was a very poor communicator. And thirdly, he was faced, even the day before he announced his policy, with a barrage of this Karl Rove type negative advertising, which never allowed him to get off on the right foot. So the Liberals never really explained such a tax. Jim Hansen, who's a highly regarded scientist in the United States, is very strongly opposed to a cap and trade system, has argued that if you had a carbon tax, the way to get public acceptance is you take all the money from the carbon tax and you'd send it right back to the public as dividends, but it'd be an equal dividend for each citizen, so that those who polluted a lot would still end up paying. Those who had very little pollution would actually end up as winners. So there are ways to design it.
Got about 3.5 minutes to go here, and Tim, I'm going to ask you to comment on something that Ben Lieberman, who's in Washington tonight with the Heritage Foundation, what he wrote in a position paper on this. Here's what he had to say. Trying to spend ourselves rich has always proven to be a bad idea, and trying to simultaneously spend ourselves rich and green would be even more disappointing. What do you think of that, Tim?
Well, I mean, I guess there's two different issues there, and one is the question of, is there a government role to play in getting out of an economic recession? And I mean, I guess that's a whole other philosophical issue, which you may or may not be subscribed to. I'm not going to dive into that one, but in terms of it doesn't make sense to be. I don't see green as necessarily being contradictory to the economy. We have countries that we can see as examples. I mean, Germany, for example, has 250,000 people employed in renewable energy right now. So, this is a new industry we can create. This is a whole new set of jobs that we can create. Just because they happen to be green doesn't necessarily mean that they're not real jobs and they're not real high-paying, high-skilled jobs. So, I think it's a big contradiction there to say that we shouldn't be spending money on green to get out of this crisis.
Let me get Ben Lieberman to follow up. Ben, would you deny that a green stimulus will, in fact, create a lot of jobs?
It will create make-work jobs. For example, the nations that we've been talking about, Germany, Spain, yes, they have wind energy jobs because they have wind mandates, but actually these are all nations that have higher unemployment rates than in the U.S. When wind energy is created, it takes a lot of tax dollars. That siphons jobs elsewhere where that money would have otherwise gone. And because wind energy is more expensive, every one of these countries that were mentioned has higher electricity prices. That's a job killer too. So unfortunately, I think these alternative energy mandates lead to higher energy costs. Sure, they create jobs within those industries, but they kill jobs elsewhere. David Crane?
Well, I have a lot of respect for Ben, but I think he's wrong. I think that that you can, in fact, we don't have a choice. We have to restructure our energy system. We can use the current economic environment to put us headed in that direction. Ben mentioned earlier, government can't pick winners. Government often picks winners. It's also true they pick losers. The market picks winners. The market picks losers. My stockbroker picks winners. My stockbroker picks losers. So there's always that discrepancy. But one of the roles of government is to deal with uncertainty and risk. And this is a period where we have to make a transition. We have a huge deadline coming up. The end of this year, we're supposed to negotiate internationally the successor to the Kyoto Agreement. And so that I think you'll see that 30% number in the US go up as media concentrate much more heavily later this year on how those targets are going to be met, and you'll see more of the science coming out which exposes the threats we're faced to. So I think that government does have a role to play. I don't agree that it can create thousands of new jobs next week out of pursuing a green stimulus, or even next month. It takes longer than that. But we're in for the long haul. We're in for a bad year this year and slow years for the next couple of years after that, I would think, and therefore stimulus will be important over that whole period.
And David Crane gets the last word on the program tonight. We're out of time. Can I thank Ben Lieberman from the Heritage Foundation on the line from Washington, D.C., Tim Wise from the Pembina Institute in Ottawa. Good to have both you gentlemen on the line for us. David Crane, the columnist for the Toronto Star, among other papers, and Ben Dawkes, the policy analyst from the C.D. Howe Institute, both here in studio in Toronto. Thanks, gentlemen.